In his excellent 1998 book on the Scotch, Grandmaster Peter Wells famously described this opening as an idea leading to a rich strategic imbalance. Garry Kasparov went further when he stated that, apart from the Rye Lopez, in his opinion, the Scotch is the only opening after 1 e4, e5 to offer white any serious winning chances at all. Now certainly Kasparov has always been willing to back up those words with action, because in over 20 games using the Scotch he's yet to lose, racking up point after point in devastating attacking style. He seems to find new ideas and novelties in every line, forcing play, bemusing even the strongest of opponents with these innovations. Therefore the Scotch seems a perfect vehicle for his demonic energy and phenomenal chess talent. Now, thanks to this exclusive patronage, the Scotch enjoys great popularity at all levels of chess, and this popularity looks set to continue. It's a complex, fascinating opening, which almost always produces an interesting game. Before we look at his great games, I just want to kick around a few ideas with you to show you the basic aims and aspirations of the Scotch game. And let's just get to the basic position. So white plays e4, black e5, knight f3, knight c6, and now here comes d4, opening up the centre. E takes d4, and now knight takes d4. And I think we can see already that white has a very slight advantage in this position, based around the pawn at e4. It's a strong central dominant pawn controlling the d5 square. White hopes that, under cover of this strong pawn, he's going to be able to develop his pieces aggressively and get onto the attack. However, black must do his utmost to counter this idea, and black responds usually very energetically in the Scotch, leading to very strange positions, where both players are put onto their mettle early, trying to find the best squares for their pieces. Let me just show you one of the main lines very quickly. Let's say black plays knight f6, white takes on c6, damaging black's pawn structure. Black doesn't want the queens off at this stage, so b takes c6. e5, there we are, that's the first disruptive move. And now black plays a slightly unnatural move, queen to e7, blocking in the bishop on f8. And white responds with queen to e2, again blocking in his bishop. Black plays knight d5, this is one of the main lines by the way, and white plays c4, leading to what I consider to be a very odd position. White has problems with his bishop on f1, and his slightly loose pawn structure. For instance, how strong is that pawn on e5? It might inhibit the black pieces, it might be very weak, we don't know yet. Meanwhile, black has both of his bishops to think about, and the knight on d5 looks a bit exposed, added to which black's got a slightly strangely positioned queen. So a very odd positional round, typical of the positional Scotch. Another example typical of the strange positions that can arise in the early opening occurs after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4, and then now the classical main line, bishop to c5. Well, before Kasparov came onto the scene and started baffling his opponents with his strange ideas, white would normally play knight b3 in this position. But Kasparov showed that knight takes c6 might well be quite a promising move for white. Hitherto, this move had thought to be completely innocuous because of black's reply, queen to f6. But now Kasparov came out with another very strange move, queen to d2. That is his trademark. Okay, d takes c6, knight c3, bishop e6, and now knight to a4. And I remember the first time this move was played against Nigel Short in the Savoy Theatre, London, 1993. And it caused almost consternation among the audience and the watching masters. Nobody could really work out what Kasparov was really doing. First he plays a very quiet line, then he moves his knight to the side. But looking more closely, Kasparov is placing top priority on hindering black's natural development of his pieces. That is a theme that runs through the Scotch from top to bottom, really. Non-standard moves, such as knight a4, are actually quite common in the Scotch. Kasparov is trying to set up a position where the better player has every chance of outplaying his opponent. That is his aim. And certainly Black's got very unusual problems to solve after knight a4. For instance, play may proceed, rook d8, bishop d3, bishop d4, castles. And I would say both sides have problems in this position. Of course, the biggest drawback about this position for Black is the pawn structure, because White has actually set up a winning pawn structure along the lines of the exchange Rye-Lopez. For instance, if we sweep all the pieces from the board and just leave kings and pawns, this is an identical pawn structure to the exchange Spanish, which is known to be losing for Black. The 4 white pawns on the king side constitute a majority and can create a passed pawn, whereas the 4-3 majority for Black on the queen side is going nowhere. So White's got a permanent positional trump in this position. Kasparov managed to prove in his games that, you know, Black has serious problems to solve in this very strange position. Let's just cast our eye over the opening positions once again and see if we can identify the problem pieces in each position and try and work out, you know, how each side might go about solving their problems. For instance, in the main line which we just looked at, we saw White pushing on with e5 and Black playing queen e7, an active move, pinning the pawn, and White having to unpin. So we reach a situation where both sides have blocked in their king's bishop. Now comes knight d5 for Black, c4, bishop a6, and now pawn to b3. And here we see Black's first problem piece, the bishop on a6. If Black's not very careful, that bishop can be completely shut out of the game. So Black is really depending on the move d7 to d5 at some stage to bring that bishop to life. But of course, as you can see, in this particular position, that move is going to take a good deal of arranging. So while Black is struggling to bring the bishop on a6 to life, White hopefully is getting on with active play in other areas of the board. It's easier for White to develop his bishops than it is for Black. Changing play a little bit in the main line there. We'll just run through the opening moves again. White opening up the centre in typical Scotch fashion. And then Black plays knight f6. I think this is the most common move actually at all levels. Certainly at Grandmaster level, this move is played very frequently. White takes on c6, doubling the pawns, and then hits out with this non-standard move e5. Black replies in a non-standard fashion, and White is obliged to play a strange move himself. Okay, so let's suppose in this position that Black doesn't want to strand his bishop in a kind of limbo on a6. He might play the other main line, which is knight to b6. And now we come to another crucial line in this position. White can play either knight c3 here, or he may play his knight to d2. And now Black has a problem with his bishop on f8, you know, blocked in by the queen. How is he going to develop this particular bishop? Well, it seems that queen e6 is quite a good move for Black in this position. And if White proceeds along the lines of the other line, Black plays the independent reply a5. I think this is actually quite decent for Black. Bishop b2, a4 is the main line, queen to e3, and now bishop to b4. We'll see an example of this later on. This is actually not Kasparov's favourite anymore, although we'll see a crushing win by White from him here. In fact, he prefers the move knight to c3 back on move 9. That will be my recommendation as we go along, but for now you can see that Black has solved the problem of the bishop on f8 quite adequately. It's not only Black that has problems with his bishops in the Scotch, in this particular line of the Scotch actually. If we just follow the main line one more time, where both sides develop their queen to strange squares and then knight d5, c4. In the main line of bishop a6, b3, we see that White also has a problem with his bishop on f1, blocked in by the queen. Now, I would argue that it's easier for white to develop that bishop than it is for black to get his own bishop on a6 into the game. For instance, we only need to play one more move along a main line, where black castles on the queen side, to see why. And Kasparov has favoured the move g3 in this position. And now we actually see that the bishop on f1 can come to quite a good square here. The only drawback with this manoeuvre is, does white's pawn on e5 get into trouble? This is why black takes great pains in this particular variation to attack the pawn on e5 and cause as much disruption as possible while the white king remains in the middle. Kasparov actually favours a very interesting pawn sacrifice in this position. For instance, bishop g2, and now black is just allowed to capture that pawn in the centre. Very interesting play follows after, for instance, knight d2. Black lashes out with h5. Difficult for black to develop his king side, so, you know, this has become the main line. Karpov's move, h5. Black is trying to get his rook on h8 into the game, free of charge more or less. White castles. Queen comes out to b4. And now white plays his knight to e4. I think the knight on e4 is central to white's idea of compensation in this position. Very difficult for black to dislodge that knight. You can see the bishop on a6 is still out of the game. The knight on e4 covers c3. That's a very important point. And in a very short space of time, the knight on d5 will be legitimately en prise. For instance, again, this has been played quite frequently. Queen to a5. White plays king to b1. Black is trying to exchange off his pieces and try and make the extra pawn count. But now the key move, queen to d2. Forcing exchanges, I think. Queen takes d2. That was forced because of the weakness of the pawn at d7. Off come pairs of pieces, but at the end of it all, rook to c1, you can see that the knight on e4 is boss. And black has yet to solve the out-of-play bishop on a6. Meanwhile, the knight at b6 is not ideally posted either. So in this position, you can see white's minor pieces are much more intelligently and actively posted than the black minor pieces on a6 and b6, giving white full compensation for a pawn. And in fact, Kasparov has demonstrated, you know, the viability of white's position many, many times. We now move to a kind of repertoire based around Kasparov's games. And we'll feature first of all the most common variation, the so-called Mises variation, where black plays an early knight f6, just developing his pieces as sensibly as possible. And now, instead of development himself by white, I mean, for instance, white could play knight c3. That's known as the Scotch 4 knights. Instead of that, white goes in for a structure-damaging move. Knight takes c6. A slight loss of time is involved with this move, so it might not suit everybody. Kasparov has proven that knight takes c6 unbalances the position. And this is the main idea. B takes c6, and now pawn to e5, queen e7, queen e2, knight d5, c4, bishop a6, and now I'm going to recommend the move b3 here. Black has many replies against this move. He can try g5. That's probably the most famous response. Anand surprised Kasparov with that in their 1995 World Championship match. Black can play g6 here too. Both moves have the idea of putting the pawn at e5 under pressure. Black has also castled long in this position. And finally, there's the slightly irregular move, queen to h4. Not every black player is thrilled to bits about having an out-of-play bishop on a6. So you often see in the main line of the Mises variation, if we just get to the critical position where white's played e5 and then both sides develop their queens to very strange squares, the knight comes into an exposed position in the middle. You often see black going knight b6 in this position. And we've already seen knight d2 is a possibility for white, but Kasparov has espoused a much more active move here. That is to say, knight c3, and that's the move I'll be recommending to you on this video. Note that the bishop on c1 is left uncovered. That is the main difference between this move and knight d2. Therefore, it's much more dynamic. Now, until Kasparov started using the Scotch on a regular basis in his games, if we come to the critical position after move 4, Black often played the move bishop c5. That is known as the classical variation, and indeed it is a very sensible developing move and cannot be underestimated. I suppose the main reason more Black players don't use this move these days is because of Kasparov's idea of going knight takes c6, which seems to produce a position which is actually very difficult for Black to play for the win-in. Kasparov's idea, this variation was hitherto thought totally innocuous because Black can just go queen f6 here. But Kasparov's idea is to go queen to d2 here and try and play against Black's slightly enfeebled pawn structure, assuming Black takes back with either the b or the d pawn. It's a very, very strange idea, but you'll see a very dangerous one from Black's point of view. And if you don't like that move, if it's just simply too difficult for you, Kasparov also has another trick up his sleeve against the classical variation. For instance, after bishop c5, he's also quite happy to play the line after bishop e3. And we'll also see a nice win for Kasparov in this line here on this video. So that's also a possibility, possibly more straightforward than knight takes c6. There's been a lot of interest recently in a strange fourth move for Black, which Kasparov has had a couple of times played against him. That's bishop b4 check, an original idea of Tony Miles. The main point of this move is to encourage White to play c3 when, after bishop c5, White supposedly can't develop his knight actively on the c3 square. That's the main idea. However, we'll see a fantastic Kasparov performance against veteran German Grandmaster Wolfgang Unzicker, where the German followed Miles's ideas with bishop b6, but got absolutely hammered after the innovation queen to g4. Look forward to some exciting chess in that game. Finally, I think I should mention the Steinitz variation, which actually nobody's had the bottle to play against Kasparov. That is to say, the pawn grabbing, the greedy and the very sharp queen to h4. Lots of players have told me they really like to see what Kasparov has up his sleeve against this greedy variation, which is not so easy to refute, by the way. So, as we've got no Kasparov games to go on, I'm going to just make a small suggestion here to you. I recommend the move knight c3 in this position and treat the position gambit style by going bishop e2. This is looking very promising for White at present. With two lines, obviously this is not the place to go into an encyclopedic detail in this line, but just to give you a flavour of what might happen, Black has two moves here. In the first line, he can play queen takes e4. Now I'm going to recommend the move knight d to b5 in this position, hitting c7. And if Black goes knight f6 here, allowing White to capture on c7, I'm going to recommend that White castle first. In my opinion, taking on c7 and then taking Black's rook on a8 when Black can capture on g2 is almost suicidal. There's no need to get involved in these complications. White can get a big attack by playing simple moves. So the main line of this particular variation runs as follows. Black hoovers off the knight on c3 to try and reduce White's attacking prospects, takes back, b takes c3, and now Black has to attend to c7 eventually, so king to d8. That's the characteristic of this line. White's quite happy to give up a pawn or two in order to keep the Black king in the middle. Now he must build up his attack. One way to do this might be, and this has been played quite a few times, just simple development with bishop e3. Black lacks coordination. It's going to take him ages to get his pieces together and coordinated, so White doesn't need to rush. Instead, he builds up, for instance with a move like rook e1. Now, with potential embarrassment looming on the e-file, Black gets his queen out of the way, queen d5, and White is simply not interested in that sort of thing. Queen to f5, queen to a3, and now development with rook a d1. One of the nice features of this variation is, for me, how White doesn't need to rush. He simply marshals his forces in the centre and relies on Black's lack of coordination to provide compensation. the attack will come in time. Presumably, after rook a d1, white's main threat now is c4 to c5, putting pressure on the pawn at d6. There may even be sacrifices on d6 for black to worry about, hence his next move, rook to e7. Now c4, bishop e6, bishop f3, rook d7, again the rook on a8 out of play, very difficult for black, and now simply bishop takes c6, b takes c6, knight to d4, producing a very unenviable situation for the second player. It's a three-way fork by the knight on d4, c6 is attacked, f5 is attacked, and e6 is attacked. White has plenty of prospects. He will go in and take on c6 with check. The queen can come into a6 to b7. White has numerous attacking prospects. Returning to the position after bishop e2 now, black might try the developmental knight f6 in preference to queen takes e4. But I think with the move queen h4, you can't change your mind like this. You've already burned your bridges when you go queen h4, so just to revert to natural development in this position is a serious mistake. And white can get onto the attack straight away by simply castling. Now the move that black would like to make in this position is to castle, because that blends in with knight f6, doesn't it? But after knight f5, it turns out that the black queen is actually lost in this position. So, it's difficult for black. He can't mix plans like this. He's got to continue in unstereotyped fashion. That explains why, after white's castling, black normally takes on c3. But that allows a tremendous shot, knight to f5, exposing the position of the queen on h4. After which black has got to continue again with very risky moves. Queen takes e4, for instance. Now white should throw in a series of disruptive moves, hitting the queen. He kicks off with bishop to d3. Well, black's got to stay in touch with g7 here, I think. So queen to g4. And now an excellent move by white, f3. And this allows the move bishop d4 check. But to play this for black would be a serious mistake. Let me just show you why. After the simple king h1, black again has problems with his queen. If he goes queen h5, knight takes g7 check is an immediate disaster. So queen g6, the only other square, and white obviously has two very promising possibilities. White can go knight d6 check, for instance, picking up the queen. But that really allows black far too much compensation. He gets three pieces. Why mess around when you can choose the safe move and the steady move knight takes d4? Regaining all material at a stroke, and still the black queen is embarrassed. After queen h5 only move, knight f5, I really would not like to be in black's shoes. His queen almost looks like a goner to me. Well, the first Kasparov masterpiece I want to show you is a game he played against his eternal opponent, Anatoly Karpov. This was played in the Tilburg tournament, 1991, and it's one of Kasparov's earliest games with the Scotch. d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4. Of course, the two players in this game contested the Scotch on a number of occasions in the 1990 World Championship match, New York, Lyon. And Kasparov was able to put Karpov under terrible pressure in that match. So, a year later, we were looking to Karpov to come up with some sort of improvement for black. Okay, well, knight f6. We know by now that white goes in for the structure-damaging knight takes c6, b takes c6, and now e5, queen e7, queen e2, knight d5, c4, and now Karpov tried bishop a6. Alright, well, b3 was played. And in this particular game, Karpov played the move g6. A logical move, preparing perhaps bishop g7, and maybe f6. If white's got an Achilles heel in this position, it has to be the pawn at e5. I mentioned early on in the video that this pawn was, quite controversial. As it stands, it inhibits the natural flow of black's pieces, but it could become very weak. And this is what Karpov's trying to demonstrate with the move g6. Well, Kasparov played the move f4. You would have expected bishop to b2, but he prefers f4. He's got another idea for the bishop on c1. And that was shown after pawn to f6, and now bishop to a3. A key idea. Trying to interrupt the natural flow of black's pieces. Well, I don't think it's very sensible for black to go into a self-pin in this position, for instance knight b4. So Karpov played queen to f7. And now the first finesse, queen to d2. As soon as the black queen steps aside, the white queen does likewise, protecting f4, and now the knight on d5 has to move. Knight went back to b6, and now came a typical Kasparov move, unleashing a series of tactics. He played the key move, pawn to c5, with a double attack. You'll note the knight on b6 is immediately threatened by the pawn at c5, but so is the bishop on a6 by the bishop on f1. Interesting, black's next move is forced. Bishop takes f1, but now comes Kasparov's idea. C takes b6. And it turns out black's got some problems in this position, based upon the pawn at b6. You know, if he goes in for natural moves, that pawn at b6 can cause him a lot of hassle by maybe capturing on c7, or perhaps advancing to b7. After this move, black should probably play bishop takes a3, after which Kasparov was intending to go b7. But Karpov was so confused by this sudden change of emphasis in the game that he made a mistake. He played a takes b6. And I think he missed white's next brilliant reply. Can you see it? Well, Kasparov played the very interesting move now, pawn to e6. Now, if black takes with the queen on e6, he gets into trouble after king takes f1. It turns out that he can't capture on a3 twice because he'd lose his queen to a pin after rook e1. That's the whole point of e6. Dragging the queen onto the e-file. This explains Karpov's next ugly move, d takes e6. But it can be no solution, because after bishop takes f8, rook d8, you can see what's going to happen. White's going to win a piece here. Queen to b2, bishop takes g2, Karpov's forced into desperate moves already. He had to do that, otherwise white would just capture on f1 with the piece up. Well, he gets the piece up anyway, but black's hoping to sort of make a fight of it with his pawns. But after king takes f8, queen takes c6, the result of the game was already clear. Black's only got 2 pawns for the piece. It's just a question of time before white can develop his pieces. You don't actually see black getting a quick attack going in this position. Amazing, but after 19 moves, white has already got a winning game, and that against the number 2 player in the world. You don't see that very often. Well, play proceeded. Rook to d6, king to g7. The first thing that Karpov's got to do is to get his pieces coordinated as quickly as possible. And it's just interesting to see, you know, how simply white plays this position. Nothing fancy. He castles on the queen side. He doesn't believe in ghost Kasparov, so he castles, presuming to move the knight on d2 and then swap the rooks. The more pieces that come off, the easier it will be for Kasparov. Okay, well, queen e8, and now another very cold-blooded move by white. Queen takes c7 check. Again, the point of this, the queen on e8 needs an open diagonal to prepare rook c6. When black blocks on d7, as he did, the white queen just goes back in complete safety now that black can't play rook c6 anymore. So white has just won another pawn. Okay, well, the game went on. Queen b8, really, Karpov should resign in this position. Probably just didn't feel like it. You know, when you've been humiliated like this, completely outplayed in the very opening of the game, you just feel bad. So you don't want to resign. Just play on for as long as possible and try and make it to move 40 or something, a respectable number of moves. But of course, it's completely lost. Just takes another pawn. Completely ruthless. Black takes on f4. Queen comes back to e3. queen to g4, attacking the rook on d1. Rook steps aside, queen h4, rook g3, going through the motions now. Black tries to get some activity going, pushing his kingside pawns, but it never comes to anything. Why should it? I mean, you know. So rook d1 check, rook takes d1, queen takes d1, king b2, pawn to h5, rook to g3, queen h1, still thrashing around. But eventually, white will get his act together, and there we have it. The double attack on the queen at h1, the pawn on g6. This is completely hopeless. Queen's come off. Black tries a few last desperate moves. But now comes the main trump in the position. White's a pawn, king g6, pawn to e4. Up come the pawns. Little bit of safety play at the end. And now rook across to a3. Finally, black managed to resign. So a complete demolition of Anatoly Karpov there. The number 2 player in the world champion for many, many years, was unable to see his way through the strange complications of the Scotch. The second game I want to show you is Kasparov with white against Ivan Sokolov from Bosnia. And this was played in the Yerevan Olympiad in 1996. And it's interesting because it features a little twist in the opening by Kasparov. A slight move order nuance. Well, we quickly get the main line of the Mises variation yet again. I should stress that it's very, very common, this particular variation, so worth exploring in some depth. And now you'll recall that b3 has hitherto been the main line. Well, in this particular game, Kasparov went pawn to g3. And you have to remember that this game was played in 1996, a year after his match versus Anand, where after b3, black went g5. The move g3 in this position says to me that Kasparov had not yet found the antidote to g5 on move 9. So, I mean, obviously here for black, g5 is not quite as applicable because white hasn't weakened the a1 to h8 diagonal. So black's got to find another move. Sokolov went g6. Whereupon Kasparov now returned to familiar territory with the move b3. Back to the game against Karpov, actually, with g5 having been dissuaded. So there we are, g3 on move 9. Interesting move order nuance for you. Well, now, after b3, black played bishop g7. You'll recall that Karpov went f6 and got into terrible trouble. Now black plays a far more natural move. And over the next few moves, we see both sides developing naturally. Whose position has the more potential? That's the real question to answer. So black castles. This corresponds to what a lot of players will do in this position, particularly if they're making it up. They'll just try and play the most natural moves available and try and gang up on your e-pawn, I think. So bishop g2, rook fe8. I mean, that's a natural consequence. And now white castles. And here's the first little trick. We see that black can't take on e5 in this position because then, at the end of it all, the knight on d5 hangs. So in order to legitimately threaten the pawn on e5, black has to move his knight. And Sokolov played knight b6. But now can you see what I mean about awkward pieces in the Scotch? You know, the hindrance of the opponent's natural development. The problem for black in this position is not the e-pawn. You know, he's focusing on the e-pawn. It's the knight on b6 and the bishop on a6. Those two pieces are going to take some time to solve. And white is hopefully going to use that time to build his initiative. That's the theme of the whole position. Well, white played rook e1, protecting his pawn, and now black went through with d5. Returning to the ideas section right at the start of the video, I mentioned the bishop on a6. How does black get it into the game? And I said that, well, d5 had to come at some time or another. Well, here we see an example of that move. Pawn to d5. Black's trying to bring the bishop on a6 to life. Kasparov played queen c2. Another one of his tactical nuances. You know, pointing out that, yes, well, black can take on c4 with the pawn, but after bishop takes c6, he loses the exchange. Hence, queen c5, knight d2. And Sokolov centralises pieces with rook a d8, avoiding d takes c4, knight e4. Kasparov played rook a c1, and black played pawn to d4. White went knight to f3, and black tried his very hardest to make the most of his asset with pawn to d3. And this for me is a particularly instructive game, because I think this is how a normal opponent will play. He won't enter into any fishy complications, he'll just try to be playing straightforward moves. This is what black has tried to do in this game. Centralisation, creating a passed pawn, pushing that pawn. But it turns out that after these strange complications, the white pieces are suddenly on much better squares. For my money, black has still failed to solve the problem of his queenside pieces. Bishop c8 was played. Easy to understand. And now white played a very good move indeed, in my opinion, pawn to h3. Simply to cut out the idea bishop g4, takes f3, and then the pawn on e5 is very weak. Sokolov played h5. And now rook cd1 pointed out to black that the d-pawn might not necessarily be a strength. It's only a question of time before white surrounds that pawn and wins it. This is why Sokolov played bishop f5. And I've no doubt at all that at this stage he felt that his position was satisfactory. Nice centralisation, the knight on b6, not ideal at the moment, but still, you know, surely it can come into the game. And it's here that Kasparov unleashes a fantastic idea. He played pawn to e6, a clearance sacrifice. And now there are two lines. If black plays f takes e6, white goes bishop takes g7, king takes g7, queen c3 check, king g8, and now knight to e5. And there are serious problems for black in this position. White threatens g4, winning a piece. There are dark square weaknesses around the black king, which are very difficult to repair. And black's d-pawn is very weak. The knight on e5 is a tower of strength, so all things considered, this is a horrible position for black. Return to the position after e6. Black could try bishop b2. But then comes the Zwischenzug, e takes f7 check, king takes f7, and only now, queen takes b2. I consider that this position is very difficult for black. He's got a very exposed king, and the dark squares are almost fatally weak. So, again, you can understand why Sokolov doesn't go in for this. So, to the game itself, where white has played this brilliant move e6, and Sokolov played rook takes e6. Well, Kasparov took on e6, bishop takes e6, and now bishop takes g7. I think that's the fundamental idea, to get rid of black's fianchetto bishop to expose the position of his king. King takes g7, queen c3 check, king g8, and now rook takes on d3. Rook takes, queen takes. And now this position shows us the basic problem for black. He's got two weaknesses to defend. Whereas before he had this pawn on d3, that was providing counterplay. Now he's got no pawn on d3, no passed pawn at all. He's got a weak king. That's the first point. The dark squares around the king are very weak, so he's got to look after his king. He can't just leave it there to be mated. I mean, for instance, you could just imagine white manoeuvring a knight to e4 and a queen to the long diagonal. Very weak king, attack. But it's not only that that's the problem for black, it's his queen side. The queen side pawns are very weak as well. So using the principle of two weaknesses, it's actually incredibly difficult for black to defend this position, because he can't look after both his weaknesses at the same time. That is what Kasparov is trying to prove in the ensuing play. Alright, well, it's high time black got his knight back into the game. So knight d7 was played, and now queen to c3. Preventing any exchange, just grabbing some squares. Black played bishop f5. Not a lot that black can do, really, apart from sit and wait. And now white caused the bishop some hassle, just bringing the queen back to d2. And now we see the problem, isn't it? Black's defending his dark squares. He's got his knight back into the game, but look at his queenside pawns. Ripe for the plucking. And so it turned out. The rest of the game, compared to what's gone before, is relatively simple fare. Black played c5. White just took off the bishop. Queen takes f5. and now queen to a5. Absolutely no point in inviting any sort of complications whatsoever when you can play a move like queen a5. Something's dropping in black's position. He tried a last thrash, some sort of an attack on the dark squares, but Kasparov was easily up to the task, re-centralising his queen. Black went queen f6, but after the simple move queen takes h4, he'd had enough. There's no pleasure in playing on in a position like this against Garry Kasparov. We're moving on a year now. We come to the 1997 Linares tournament, and Kasparov's opponent with black is the very solid Yugoslav Predrag Nikolic. And again, this game's very interesting because we come back now to Kasparov's World Championship match against Anand. c4, bishop a6, b3. And now the move Anand surprised white with in that match, the move pawn to g5. And this is the move Nikolic played here. And of course the main advantage of that move over the more restrained g6 is that black hopes to artificially isolate the white pawn on e5, making it difficult for white to play f4. That's the main idea. Anyway, the point is, in the Kasparov-Anand game, this move was unqualified success due to some nifty tactics by black. So it's interesting, a couple of years on, that Kasparov had actually repaired this line. He was now ready to play against g5. Well, he kicked off with the move g3. We've seen that before. And after bishop g7, you know, black is pointing the finger at the e-pawn. So this time white's really got no choice. He's got to play bishop b2. And after castles, black's idea is the same. He's going to try and target the pawn on e5. Of course, the drawback, the obvious drawback to the move g5 is it's very weakening. You know, the light squares f5 and h5 are seriously weakened. And if black's best is to castle on the king side, it's going to be a bit dodgy. Everything's hinging on whether white's e-pawn falls before he can get to the weaknesses against the black king. Kasparov goes in for the immediate strike. He kicked off with knight d2. Black played f6, still trying to batter away at that e-pawn. And now the first key move for white, queen to h5. And as we've seen before, as soon as the white queen moves, the knight on d5 is immediately embarrassed. Black's got to move it. And Nikolic went in with the move knight to b4. I think he's got to do that. He can't really go passive in this position, otherwise white's just going to dismember his king with a move like h4, for instance. So knight b4, but Kasparov in full flow, it's pretty certain that he had this position on the board, you know, before the game. Maybe he had the whole game prepared. You're not going to stop Kasparov from playing h4. And this was the crushing reply to knight b4. And this must have come as a real shocker to Nikolic. And of course it's the point of Kasparov's prepared analysis. Well, we must see what happens when black goes in and takes the rook. I think that's the first key idea. Of course Nikolic didn't do that. He thought for a long time here. Knight c2 check, king d1, knight takes a1. Well, white's next move is clear. H takes g5. And you see, when you're considering the sacrifice of material, what you've got to consider is, you know, can you get your pieces into the right places at the right time? Well, black is a rook up in this position. But the problem is, his bishop on a6, his knight on a1, and his rook on a8 all aren't really participating to the defence of his king. h7's threatened, with mate to follow. So, for instance, bishop h8 might be played. But then comes bishop d3, again very pointed. f5 only move, and now black is subjected to a vicious assault. Queen takes h6, queen g7, and now queen h5. And Kasparov considers that black's position is almost hopeless here. His king is under terrible pressure. White's going to recapture the knight on a1 as he pleases, really. He can take on f5. If bishop captures on f5, you've got knight e4 and then knight f6 to follow. It's a terrible position for black. Returning to the position after h4 now, all that analysis might help to explain why Nikolic tried what seems to me to be a rather desperate move, actually. Pawn to g4, attempting to block out Kasparov's attack. But now I suspect that, you know, black simply forgot about this next incredibly strong move. King to d1. The thing is that black has problems with his knight now. The knight on b4 is in a very compromised position. White simply threatens a3, as well as black's king, of course. Black's king is also very porous. So Nikolic played, again the only move I think, c5. Kasparov hit the knight, driving it back to c6, and the net effect of driving that knight back was to enable white to be able to play bishop to d3. f5, what else? And now comes bishop takes f5, bishop takes e5, and now rook to e1. And black is in terrible trouble. Several problems loom. The pin on the e-file is very unpleasant. Black's king is weak. White threatens to play bishop e4 to d5 check. The knight on d2 threatens to come to e4 perhaps, and then g5 at the right moment. And, you know, it's virtually impossible to get at white's king. White's king, although it's in the centre, is actually very safe here. Meanwhile, the bishop on a6 looks simply horrible. Another strong grandmaster in a lost position after, say, 15, 16 moves. It's quite amazing. So, the game continued. d6, trying to shore up the bishop. Now came the manoeuvre of the bishop to e4 that I mentioned earlier. The knight on c6 is threatened, so bishop b7. Queen captures on g4 check. And Nikolic, in this position, went queen to g7. Just taking that move back, there's a completely convincing line for white after king to h8. After that, white plays in forcing style. Bishop takes c6. Pawn to f4. There's only one move now for black, and that's bishop d7. Queen comes to e2. Black tries his last chance. Queen g7, threatening bishop to g4. But no funny business for white now. He just goes in, takes on e5 twice, swaps off with a totally winning position. Back now to the position after queen takes g4 check, and now another miserable move by Nikolic, queen g7. Bishop d5 check, king h8, bishop takes e5 was played. Again, this is very forcing. D takes e5, queen takes g7 check, and now knight e4. That is an absolute peach of a knight. Full domination over black's position. Rook a d8, knight takes c5, why not? Bishop c8, and now rook a2 convinced black that he had nothing better than to resign. The rook's coming to d2, but if we count the pawns, we see that white is 2 pawns up with no problems. This is a typical example of the bemusing tactics that can occur in this variation of the Scotch. And if you have it all prepared beforehand, especially the attacking ideas, you know, you've got it made. Moving on to 1999 now, we come to a game Garry Kasparov played as white against Michael Adams, the super solid grandmaster from England. Again, it features the Mises variation of the Scotch. We've seen all these moves before. Both sides play in slightly unorthodox fashion. And now, not bishop a6, but knight to b6. When Kasparov plays his patent idea, knight to c3. Queen e6 was played, and now queen to e4 by white. That's an interesting move, bringing the queen to the 4th rank, increasing her mobility, and at the same time enabling the bishop on f1 to come into the game. Well, Adams has got a specific idea in mind, emanating from a game Ponomarev versus Spassky, Cannes 1998. The idea is coming up. Black takes on c3, voluntarily surrendering the bishop pair, and now goes through with the freeing move, pawn to d5. That's the main idea of black's setup. The pawn on e5 is pinned, and what black's hoping is going to mount unsustainable pressure against the pawn at c4. As you can see, queen, knight, bishop and pawn all ganging up on the poor white pawn at c4. Well, Kasparov plays a new move now. Queen to h4. Actually, in Ponomarev versus Spassky, the game continued queen to f3, draw agreed, which doesn't tell us very much other than, you know, white thought that black's position was quite okay. Kasparov's new idea is a good one, keeping the c4 square under observation, which can prove useful in the tactics that follow. Well, black should take on c4. That's the main idea of the whole line. And now white utilises the idea of the pin on the pawn at c4 to play a simple move, bishop to e2. Now came knight d5 by Adams. And white played bishop to d4. c5 was played. Bishop takes c5, and now Adams reveals his idea, knight to c3. So some intricate tactics going on at present. Black is trying to stop white from castling. That's the main idea of going knight c3. And he's hoping to be able to capture on e5 in peace. Kasparov played bishop takes c4, queen takes e5 check, and played the only move now to avoid the loss of a piece, bishop to e3. And Adams played knight to e4, after which white seized the opportunity to castle. Then came bishop takes c4, b takes c4, and black castled. And I think we can safely say we've come to the end of both players' opening preparation. How to judge this position? Well, it doesn't seem, to be honest, as though white's got very much out of this opening. But Kasparov's next few moves are very, very strong, and actually demonstrates that the objective truth is that white does have an edge because his bishop is potentially much better than the black knight. Well, rook fe1 is fairly easy to see. Rook fe8 and now pawn to f3. White's hoping to make capital of the numerous black pieces, especially the queen, on the e-file. Knight went back to d6, bishop f2, queen to f5. And now if black's knight were anchored in on d6 for good, probably black is actually in the ascendancy here because he's got every chance of rounding up the white pawn on c4. But the pawn at c4 is not a static weakness. It's not going to stay there forever. It's a dynamic weakness. And this is why Kasparov played c5. Not only is that a very strong advance, it's actually making the life of the knight very difficult. Knight came to b5, queen to b4, and now we actually get a better idea of what is really going on in the position. Black has some problems with his knight. Well, as you can see, the knight's got nowhere to go at present. Rook e b8 looks most uncomfortable after the simple rook a b1. Black is in a pin. So Adams tried queen to d3. Rook e d1 was played. Everything's hinging around that knight. Black tried a little tactic. White kept on the knight, very important. And now the only move to keep that knight under observation is queen e2. Rook e1, and now we come to the big pressure moment of the game. I think that the responsibility of defending this position was obviously, weighing down heavily on Adams because he now makes a mistake. In fact, the only move in this position is knight c3, another Zwischenzug. When after queen c6, queen b5, queen takes c7, rook takes e1 check, rook takes e1, knight takes a2, black has certain counter chances. Best play might proceed c6, knight b4, rook c1. When it's very difficult to say exactly what's going on, but I know I'd probably prefer to be white in this position because my pawn's closer to queening, I've got a good bishop, a safe king, and black has some problems with his back rank. The a pawn doesn't look too dangerous for the moment. That would be best for black. But coming back to the position after rook e1, Adams was obviously under so much pressure that he now committed a mistake. And this is a very easy mistake to make. He played queen d3, keeping on the knight, a natural move. What he missed was that after rook takes e8 check, rook takes e8, rook d1, he now has serious problems. The black queen is overloaded. Simply by exchanging off a pair of rooks, white has actually weakened, fatally weakened, black's back rank. Well, Adams actually resigned this position. The reason for his resignation can be quickly seen after queen e2, rook e1. there you have it. Weakness of the back rank, forcing black to surrender his queen, and then the whole position falls apart. A very swift and surprising end to this game. Moving on to the year 2000, and Jan Timman is now sitting behind the black pieces, facing Kasparov, and he thought, presumably, that he had an improvement prepared on the Adams game from black's point of view. So, both players conveniently entered this line. As you'll recall, black plays knight b6, that's the essence of his idea, and Kasparov goes on with his patent move, knight to c3. White put his queen on e4, and now black went through with this voluntary surrender of bishop for knight on c3 in order to get the move d5 in, putting pressure on c4. Well, a year passed since the Adams game. Kasparov carries on with his idea. Queen h4, d takes c4, bishop e2, knight d5. And now, in place of bishop d4, as played against Mickey Adams, Kasparov played the simple move, bishop takes c4. So he, in fact, was the first to improve in this position. Now, obviously that's a very simple move. The problem for black, the precise problem, is he's got bad endgames lurking. So Timman has actually got to demonstrate already why he's gone in for this position. Otherwise, white's going to have a safe nagging edge. He castles, puts his rook in the middle, probably on e1, and then the other rook to c1, and black's c-pawns will become weaker as more pieces are exchanged and the game progresses. So this explains black's decision to lash out with the most unusual move, pawn to g5. But this looks rather risky. Everything is going to hinge on whether black can prove that the white king lingering around in the centre is weak. Well, Kasparov played queen to d4. Bishop captured on c4, queen recaptured, and now knight to f4 reveals the point of g5. Alright, queen takes e6 check, knight takes e6 was played, and now white castled on the queen side. So actually, Kasparov's gone in for a rather sober way of playing the position here. But despite the reduction of material, white still has slightly better prospects. So I have to say it's a pretty unpleasant position for black to defend. There are numerous weaknesses on the queen side. White has prospects of attacking those weaknesses, for instance by playing a manoeuvre such as rook to e1 to e4, and then swinging across the fourth rank. There are various ideas. Well, very difficult for black. He played king to e7 and tried to reduce material by swapping off a pair of rooks. White was only too happy to exchange pieces in the full knowledge that all the endgames, king and pawn endings, are very bad. The only endgame that is possibly not very tenable for white is the bishop versus knight endgame. Because, you know, white doesn't really want his bishop on c3 looking at a pawn at e5 for the whole game. But white's next move, Kasparov's move, is very strong, very technical, excellent. Rook to e4. Well, black's got nothing better than to try and mount some counterplay against the e-pawn. And white could play rook a4 actually in this position, but he prefers the simple king c2. Black plays c5, hoping for some salvation in a rook ending, but that enables white to go rook a4. And everything's hinging on whether after knight d4, bishop takes d4, c takes d4, rook takes a7, king d7, whether white can win this position. Kasparov had seen a long way though, and he demonstrates with brilliant technique that this position can indeed be won. Kicking off with king d3, a lovely square for the white king. Okay, black takes on e5, and now another very accurate move by white, rook to a4. Not king takes d4, of course, because then after rook e2, black's rook is very active indeed, and that's precisely what you don't want in rook and pawn endings. Your opponent's rooks become very active. Well, we're just threatening to sweep that pawn off, so c5 is probably forced, and now b4, breaking up black's pawn structure. And this is the position that Kasparov was striving to achieve. White's going to win probably both of those central pawns and gets one or two dangerous passports on the queen side. Well, what is black to play? Timon tried centralisation, but after check, he's now got a difficult decision to make. If he goes in this position, let's say he centralises with king d5, which looks logical but wasn't played. Now white has rook a5. I think that's the main reason king d5 wasn't played. This pin is very uncomfortable. And after king d6, there's exchanges. White's got an outside passed pawn. That would normally be enough to win the game on its own, but with the help of a move g4, that's an excellent move by the way, because it freezes black's kingside pawn structure. With the help of that move, white wins easily now. Simple technique, the black king has to come over to gobble the a pawn, meanwhile white's king goes on a raid against black's entire kingside. So that would win for white. So all that goes to explain why after rook a6 check, Timon preferred king f5, but of course that move allows b5. Rook d5 was played by black, and he's obviously hoping that the trick pawn to c4 is going to save him, but Kasparov's actually seen everything in this position. He played rook c6, and now, well, a4 is high on the agenda, followed by a quick advance of the pawn, so black's got to try his last shot, which is pawn to c4. But I wonder if you can see the elegant way that white wins this game. Obviously white can take on c4 with the rook and play an ending a pawn up. Is there better? Well, yes, you are right. There is better. King takes c4, d3, and just at the moment when it looks as though black is actually going to score an amazing triumph in this game, g4 causes immense and total frustration. Timon resigns straight away, seeing that after king g4, white has a decisive idea. Rook c4 check, and if king f3, rook d4. There's one last try, but b6 scotches everything. So rather than see that on the board, Timon decided to pack it in. We now move on to a couple of Kasparov's games against the classical variation. That's to say, bishop c5 on move 4. Prior to the popularity of knight takes c6, I would have said that bishop c5 is a very reasonable try for black. Now I'm not so sure. But in the first game, this is Garry Kasparov with white against Nigel Short, grandmaster from England with black. And this was in the pre-knight takes c6 days, before his World Championship match. He might not have wanted to reveal his ideas. This game was played in 1992 and featured the move bishop to e3. Personally, I think this is quite a respectable move, but it has to be learned. There's no shortcutting with bishop e3. If white wants any advantage at all out of this line, he has to learn it. Nevertheless, I still believe it's quite a viable try, and it leads to some very obscure positions. Anyway, for the time being, white's threatening knight takes c6, winning a piece. Short follows the prescribed formula in the books, queen to f6. White reinforces the knight. That's the main idea of this system, the initial idea anyway. And now bishop to c4. I think it was Grandmaster Sveshnikov who was the main exponent of this variation in Grandmaster chess hitherto, before Kasparov wheeled this move out against Short. Both sides castled. Bishop b6. Gary's next move is very good. Knight to c2. White is trying to control the square d5. If black can get d5 in, he frees his whole position. So this is why white's trying to stop him. If black takes on e3 now, white's knight comes to its ideal square on e3. In fact, I'm not sure that black can stop that anyway, but that's white's main idea, to train his pieces on d5. Well, Short didn't take on e3, obviously didn't like that, just preferred to develop his pieces. White takes on b6, that's part of the plan, and now pawn to f4. I think white's got a solid advantage here. As long as he controls the square d5, black can't free his game, and meanwhile white is going knight e3, queen d3, knight d2, just keeping the edge. The pawns on e4 and f4 will always give attacking chances. That is to say, if both sides play normally. Short's next move must have made Garry Kasparov sit bolt upright. Pawn to g5. Most unexpected. And in fact, I'm not altogether sure that it's very good. But you can see why Short is actually playing this way. He's a bit afraid that he's going to be driven into a prospectless position with white controlling d5 until kingdom comes, so he lashes out, hoping to wrest control of these central dark squares. But it all looks rather drastic. Perhaps this move is not so bad if it's followed up carefully, but Short, throws caution to the winds in this game very early on. Well, white played f5. Consequence, black played knight e5. Bishop went back to e2. No need for heroics by white now. That pawn on g5 and the dark square weaknesses around the king, they speak for themselves. Black brought his bishop out. White played pawn to c4, again with the emphasis on d5. And the main idea of this is to enable the knight to come to c3. Pawn went up to h5. White played queen d2. King h8 and now queen to f4. Bishop c6, and white completes the ideal arrangement of his pieces with knight to e3. And around here we start to realise that perhaps g5 wasn't such a good idea after all. Garry Kasparov's play over the next few moves just shows how white can maybe put the question to black's king here. Well, black played knight d7. Then came bishop takes g4. Excellent. H takes g4, knight takes g4, and now perhaps the only move, queen to h4. Black could have gone queen to d4 check, but that leaves his king looking very bare indeed. I think, Short's hoping to use his queen to defend. But after rook f3, threatening rook h3, knight g6, perhaps this was the only try, queen e3, another excellent move, queen takes g4, queen h6 check, king g8. It really should have been all over at this point. Now, inexplicably, Kasparov misses the winning rook g3. That really does finish black off. Because if queen takes g3, h takes g3, knight e5, the simplest win is queen g5 check, king h7, king f2. Followed by rook h1 with total carnage. Amazingly, Kasparov missed that. That's not to say that the game continuation, rook h3, isn't very strong indeed as well. It's just that it gives black a little more hope, because after queen takes h3, g takes h3, white's king is also a little bit exposed. Therefore, after knight g5, black's can have some chances. It's not quite resignable just yet. Well, f6 was played, forcing knight takes f6. Queen takes f6, rook a, e8. You can see what I mean. Black has some hope here. Rook e6, and then maybe rook f, e8, and maybe some sort of an attack against the king. All a bit vague, but it's the best black's got. Well, Kasparov continued with pointed moves and carried on in the same style. He's not going to allow black to dictate anything in this game. Rook e6, queen pinned, threatening h5. h5 was played, Short had his answer ready. Rook e5. After queen h6, it wasn't quite enough. Short carried on with his aggressive attacking style. What else has he got in this position? And then rook takes e4. Well, king g1, knight e5, and this really is now looking very bad for Nigel Short. Queen g5 check, king h7, queen f5 check, getting his queen off the g file, king h6, and now rook to f1. Black went rook e2. Still some problems. Queen f6 check was played, king h7, and now Kasparov deals with the problems by offering an exchange on g2, if black so desires. Well, bishop e4 was played, h6, and now bishop g6. Pawn to h4. rook e4, and now simply h5, and that is the winning move. I don't think black has any defence at all now. He's got to play rook g4 check, but white re-sacrifices the queen to obtain a winning position with rook f7 check. Now black could resign with a clear conscience. He limps on for a few more moves. King takes h6, the rook sweeps away the queenside, and finally after b3, short resigned. White's simply going to take on b6 and queen is a-pawn. A very interesting game. I think to a certain extent, a year before their World Championship match, with 5 bishop e3, Kasparov was trying to sell short a dummy, as it were, to force him to look for stuff in his preparation that Kasparov had no intention of playing in the World Championship match. Nevertheless, bishop e3 is a fine continuation, worthy of study, and can be considered a reasonable alternative to knight takes c6 on move 5, to which we now turn our attention. Well, now we come to one of the most interesting developments in the whole of Scotch theory over the past 50 years. That's to say, Kasparov's revival of the antiquated move knight takes c6 in the classical variation. And as I say, before Kasparov sprung this big surprise on Nigel Short in the 1993 World Championship, knight takes c6 was considered completely innocuous. But the main idea is complex and requires white to play two very non-standard moves. So perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised that nobody had seen this idea or considered it until Kasparov flashed it out. The first of these moves is queen d2, very strange in itself. I mean, obviously white's got to protect f2. The second of these strange moves will come up very shortly, knight to a4. Most unusual. By non-standard moves, white is trying to interfere with the natural development of the black pieces. Black's problem is, yes, he can keep his pieces active, but how long can he do that for? And if he doesn't keep his pieces active, then a bad pawn structure lurks in the wings. White's got all the advantages of the exchange Rye-Lopez in this position, with none of the disadvantages. He hasn't surrendered the two bishops. That's the key difference. And putting the knight on a4 is a small price to pay. Well, white continues with stabilising moves. I mean, if white can completely stabilise the position, then he's going to be clearly better because of the pawns. So this is why Yusupov tries with all might and main to disrupt white's natural development himself. So Kasparov plays an excellent move in reply. Queen to a5. Well, what's black to do here? Once again, white threatens c7. He threatens pawn to c3. He even threatens bishop to g5, nabbing an exchange. So b5 is more or less forced, and white just goes back to c3. Then comes bishop b6, and the upshot of all of black's pseudo-activity, as it were, is that he's lost a pawn. Can black drum up enough activity now to offset the temporarily poor position of white's queen? Well, it's rather doubtful, in my opinion. Yusupov tried knight h6. And now Kasparov played another very good move indeed, bishop to e3. The point of this is that if black now takes on e3, white can even consider taking on c6 with check, nabbing a second pawn. So bishop c8 was played by black, and white was able to play queen a3, rescuing his queen from obscurity and at the same time stopping black from castling. Black took on e3, f takes e3, queen e5, but after another very good move by white, bishop e2, isn't Kasparov's technique wonderful? The advantage was clearly with white. The point of bishop e2, firstly, it restrains, restricts and controls black's knight. Secondly, it threatens rook to d1, rook a d1, taking the d file. Black has to try and castle, which again explains black's next move, rook d6. He's desperate to castle. But after rook a d1, castles, what else? Rook takes d6. It was pretty clear after rook d1 that white was increasing his advantage. Now rook d8 will be answered by queen a5 and then queen c7. So black plays c5, surrendering the b-pawn in order to try to drum up activity with bishop g4, and requiring white to play with some care now. Queen d3 was played. Queen takes b2 and pawn to a4. Kasparov is insistent that the knight on h6 will not come into the game. Queen b4, and white continues with this policy of restricting the knight by jettisoning the a-pawn in favour of knight takes d6. Well, not only is white a pawn up in this position, he's got better pieces too. It's very difficult for black. The rook on f8 is doing nothing, the knight on h6 is offside. So probably black is lost here. Bishop comes back to e6, pawn to e5. White is still keeping that knight under observation. Black brings his queen across and white now centralises, queen to e4. Lovely technique. Queen comes back to e7, rook to the open file. Pawn comes up to f5 and now not capturing on f6, which would hang the knight, but queen to c6. Black's getting slowly pushed back into the corner. King h8, queen takes c5, rook c8, and now a spectacular finish from Garry Kasparov. He sacrifices his queen. Queen takes c8 check. Bishop takes c8, rook to b8. Well, there's only one move here. Knight to g8. But after rook takes c8, the writing is really on the wall for black. White threatens bishop d5, and there doesn't seem to be a great deal that black can do about it. He tried queen a7, but now king h2 was the excellent reply. Should black play queen takes e3 now, knight f7 is immediate checkmate. So, returning to position after the very accurate king h2, black tried queen e7, but now after rook e8, queen c7, bishop d5, white demonstrated perfect and total coordination. Black resigned. A lovely game, a game of pure technique. To finish off, we've got a good old-fashioned demolition job on the black position, and Kasparov's opponent, his hapless opponent in this game, is the veteran German grandmaster Wolfgang Unzicker. And this game was played in Zurich in the year 2001. It's a particularly interesting game because it features a variation which has been more and more popular in grandmaster chess recently, thanks to the help of inventive grandmasters such as Romanishin and Miles. That's to say the move bishop b4 check. And it's a provocative move because in effect it gives white a free move. That's c3. But in giving white that move, black's arguing that he takes away the most active square for the knight on b1. That's to say the square c3. And in doing so, he prevents white from controlling the d5 square in this opening. So that's the main point. He's trying to prevent white from controlling d5. Is it worth the move? Well, we'll see. Kasparov played bishop e3 against Unzicker, and again Unzicker continued with Miles's basic idea, bishop b6, which is to stabilise black's position and then to look to play the moves d5 and f5 if he can. For instance, if black were able to play knight g e7 and then d5, he'd have a fine position. So this is why white strives to stop all that with very pointed ideas. I think Kasparov is a very poor opponent actually to choose to actually play this variation against. Very provocative, and encourages Kasparov to attack. Not a good idea, really. Well, queen g4, a strong innovation. Attacks g7, black plays virtually the only move, queen f6. And now Kasparov played queen to g3, putting the question to Unzicker. And here, the veteran grandmaster falters immediately. I think black can limit the damage here by simply playing queen to e5. That might be the best move. And after knight d2, queen takes g3, h takes g3, knight e5, bishop to e2, white can only count on a small advantage in this queenless middle game. But returning to the game, Unziker seemed to be in a very belligerent mood that day. He actually accepted Kasparov's pawn sacrifice by taking on d4 twice. And this seems to me to be a most impractical decision. For starters, after knight c3, white has a big lead in development. White's threats include rook d1, to be followed by knight d5. Knight b5 lurks in the wings. And as soon as the black queen leaves the centre or the fourth rank, bishop c4 is also on the cards. Well, I think black played the best that he could here by developing his knight. He tried to get castled as quickly as possible. But after rook d1, white has a clear advantage. White has clear dark square control and black's pieces are undeveloped and his d-pawn is very weak. Well, queen b4 was played by Unziker. White has no need to rush. Just simply rook d2. Black's weaknesses will not go away. After knight g6, again, Kasparov did not rush. Bishop to e2. And Unziker now lashed out with pawn to f5. Well, this is a typical idea. You try and compensate for your weaknesses with active play. Entirely understandable, but unfortunately, it has the net effect of weakening black's position still further. Bishop c4 check was played. The king went into the corner, and now knight to d5. That was the drawback of black's queen excursion to d4 in the first place. Unziker tried queen a4, and now e takes f5. A simple move, opening up the game. When you're better developed, you open up the game. Simple strategy. Rook takes f5 was played, and now white continued with his simple play, castles. And you can see the problem there in front of you. The bishop on c8 and the rook on a8 are simply not playing. White is playing with two extra pieces in dynamic terms. So it's hardly surprising that black goes under very quickly from this position. When you're under attack, exchange pieces. Hence, queen c6. But once again, this game is remarkable for the completely unhurried way with which Kasparov first solidifies his position and then goes over to the attack. Queen takes queen was played, knight takes queen, rook b8 only move, and simply rook e1. Very simple play. Black tried to get his queen side going with b6, but now knight b5 pointed out that it wasn't quite as simple as it looked, because after bishop b7 the d6 square creaks, and Kasparov just brought his knight to d6. Well, it's one of those positions, you know you're going to lose. It's not quite resignable. You should play on for a couple more moves, but really after rook f8, knight f7, it was time to finish matters. King g8 was played, rook takes d7, and Unziker had seen quite enough of this position. Resigns. So a game which made bishop b4 check, the topical bishop b4 check, look very dubious indeed. In order to be an expert in the Ruy Lopez, amateur players have to reconcile themselves to the study of a bewildering number of separate variations. All very well for the grandmaster or professional, but impractical for the average lover of the game who simply wants a life. So in my view, this is where the Scotch reveals itself as a very good practical choice. White has a great chance to shape the game early by more or less forcing a position which he or she has studied closely. And by contrast to the Spanish, black's choice of playable lines is limited, thus cutting down on learning time, and white has every chance of catching black out in the tricky positions that arise. It seems to me that even very strong players will have a pet line prepared against the Spanish, whereas by contrast against the dangerous Scotch, they are more uncertain, and Kasparov's games show this conclusively. In an older masterpiece on the Scotch, Tim Harding and George Botterill put their request squarely before their readers. Let's have a little more Scotch with our chess, please. Here's to richer and more enjoyable games in the future.